Okay, so just going to give it just a couple minutes to let people who are entering keep entering. Okay, so I think okay, good evening and welcome to this evening's presentation. My name is Judy Kitt and I'm the current president of the Foundation for Mind Being Research, or FMBR. If you're new to us, we were founded in 1980 by scientists and artists and healers who were interested in exploring the nature of human consciousness through the lens of science, spirituality, and ancient wisdom traditions. So for the last 40 years now, we've been working to expand the context within which we see ourselves, and as individuals and as a species, and really as part of the whole that is the universe that we know it. As we know it. We believe that as more and more of us begin to see ourselves differently as connected, new possibilities arise, including solutions to the challenges we face as a result of believing that we're separate. So I encourage you to check us out at www.fmbr.org. Before we start, I want to remind you that whether you're watching on Zoom or YouTube, you can write your questions in the chat box and I will ask the questions at the end of the presentation. So we're really excited to welcome Mark Gober to be our presenter this evening. Mark is the author of the award-winning book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which came out 2 years ago, and the sequel, An End to Upside Down Living, which just came out 3 weeks ago. He's also the host of Where Is My Mind podcast, featuring his interviews with world-leading consciousness researchers. Mark serves on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the School of Wholeness and Enlightenment, and he is an international speaker. Mark's background is in business as a partner at Sherpa Technology Group here in the Silicon Valley, and previously as an investment banking analyst in New York. He graduated magna cum laude from Princeton, where he wrote his award-winning thesis on Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning prospect theory and was elected a captain of Princeton's Division I tennis team. So Mark, welcome, and congratulations on your new book, which just came out. You can hear me, right?
I can hear you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you for having me. I think my message is very aligned with your organization. So I'm excited to share it with your audience. And I want to thank everyone else for joining. So as you mentioned, my background is in business. And now I've become very interested in consciousness. And I'm very often asked how that happened, because if we were talking several years ago, I would have had no clue about the things that I'm now studying and writing about. It's still kind of surprising to me that I'm in the position I'm in now, because there was a big shift that happened for me in 2016. I was listening to podcasts, not trying to learn about consciousness per se, but I came across ideas like psychic phenomena and survival of bodily death, things that were just not part of my worldview, and they weren't things that I was taught in my education or in my business background. Those weren't the sorts of things I was thinking about. So I started to look into it at first a bit casually, and then I saw that there was real scientific evidence for this. And then it became really just all I wanted to do, because I realized I had to rethink all of my assumptions about reality. And at first there were no plans to write a book about it. It was just out of personal interest. I wanted to understand, well, if there's this other realm of consciousness, how does that impact my life? What does it mean about how we might live? And I spent about a year researching nonstop and started to tell friends about it, who also, many of them come from a very mainstream background, hadn't heard of these topics. But the feedback I got often was very positive, and people understood the implications of some of the science I was just sharing over dinners or over casual conversations. And many of them said that just the conversations were shifting their perspectives, or they were causing people to ask questions. So I saw that not only did the concepts that we'll talk about today, not only do they impact my own life, but I saw that there could be a much broader impact. And that's when I decided to sit down and write the book, which I ended up writing in the summer of 2017. And as you mentioned, Judy, there are a number of other things that I've done since then. So I've kind of alluded to a past worldview I had. And in the scientific community, it's known as materialism. That's distinct from being materialistic and liking fancy things, although there is a relationship between the two. So when I say materialism in the context of science, I'm referring to the idea that the universe is fundamentally made of matter. So solid pieces of matter, like atoms. And the way it goes, according to the mainstream thinking in the education system, is that there was an event that happened about 13.8 billion years ago, often known as the Big Bang, and it filled the universe with units of matter. And in this big universe with units of matter floating around all over the place, you're bound to get interactions between those pieces of matter, and we call that chemistry. And when you have lots of random chemical reactions in a big universe, chance tells us that over time you will end up with a molecule that can replicate itself. That's like DNA. So with DNA, that leads to the evolution of biological organisms like a human being, which develops a brain. And from the brain comes consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I mean the subjective inner experience that we all have. Anyone listening to this or watching this right now is experiencing with consciousness. So consciousness is a fundamental aspect of all of our lives. And under this materialist perspective, which is the mainstream view in science and much of societal thinking, consciousness comes from the brain. And more generally, consciousness comes from matter. And this is precisely the framework that I've challenged with my work, and many others are doing this as well. So what exactly are the issues with this materialist framework, that consciousness comes from a material brain? What shocked me in my research was that there is an open question, even if you talk to mainstream scientists, around this connection between the brain and consciousness. And we know there is a relationship between the brain and consciousness, because if someone gets in a car accident, for example, and damages a part of the brain responsible for vision, you might see a corresponding change in the person's vision. We change the brain, we change consciousness. So there's a strong correlation there. And to use an analogy from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, he says that we can't assume that because the brain's related to consciousness that the brain is creating it. That's making a logical leap. And he says, look, if we have a large fire, firefighters show up to put out the fire. If you have a larger fire, there are more firefighters that show up. There's a very strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that appear. But do we assume that the firefighters caused the fire? Of course, we know that's not the case, but there's possibly another way to look at the two variables. And in science, we know that the brain is involved. And because we don't know how the brain creates consciousness, it's still an open question. It's known as the hard problem of consciousness. That's what mainstream scientists would call it. And what exactly is hard about this problem? What's difficult about it is that our physical body and our brain, these are physical, they're physical, made of matter. Whereas our consciousness, I can't touch my consciousness. I can touch my arm, I can touch my leg, but I can't touch consciousness. So the question becomes, how is it that something physical like a brain and body, how could that produce something that's not physical? And science doesn't know the answer, although science tends to assume that the brain is creating consciousness. And we see here on the right-hand side of the screen, Science magazine has listed this question second in its top 25 questions remaining in all of science. What is the biological basis of consciousness? In other words, how is it that our physical biology creates consciousness? Now, what I argue in my work is that the brain is actually not creating consciousness, but that the brain is acting more like an antenna receiver, or more precisely like a filtering mechanism, meaning there's a much broader reality beyond what our brain is perceiving, and our brain shows us a limited sliver of this reality. And there are a number of phenomena related to the brain which back this idea up. And the way I like to phrase it simplistically is, when you have less brain, there's more consciousness, which is completely paradoxical according to the mainstream view of science. And I'll give first example, near-death experiences. This is an instance where a person is in some kind of extreme physiological trauma, like cardiac arrest, for example, and the person might even be clinically dead, where there's little or no brain functioning at all. And yet the person has a vivid experience, sometimes hovering over the body, seeing things accurately from above the body, and having a realer than real experience at a time when the brain is barely functional or completely off. So to quote Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, when I interviewed him for my podcast, Where is My Mind? He said, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. Less brain, more consciousness. We see this also with emerging research on psychedelics, where you think that during a psychedelic trip, there would be much more brain activity all over the brain. And in some of these emerging studies, we actually see reductions in brain activity associated with an enriched consciousness. Savant syndrome is another example. These are individuals who have extraordinary mental abilities, such as musical abilities, mathematical abilities, memories. They can do really superhuman things, and at the same time, they might have severe cognitive impairments in other ways and actual damage to the brain relative to what we would call a normal brain. So here we see an enhanced consciousness in some aspects with a less functional brain. And another example I'll give is terminal lucidity. These are instances in which a person has some kind of condition, like a neurodegenerative condition, like Alzheimer's disease. And the person's memory has not been fully there for a long time, but shortly before death, the person snaps back into clarity and talks like nothing happened. So here we have a clearly damaged brain and a clear consciousness. And these anomalies support the idea that the brain in some capacity is limiting a much broader reality. And when we get the brain out of the way, we experience this broader reality. And if you're interested in that pattern, there's a great Scientific American article that's available for free online called Transcending the Brain by Dr. Bernardo Castro. So I've proposed that maybe the brain is acting in a different capacity than we're taught. The brain is filtering consciousness rather than producing it. Then how do we rethink reality if the brain isn't producing consciousness? This is a pretty big deal, given that materialism is the fundamental framework for thinking about life in many ways. And I'll give some personal anecdotes here. I totally bought into the materialist view. And if you buy into that, then when the brain shuts off, there's no consciousness. There can't be any consciousness after death. And if we live in the random universe where our consciousness doesn't continue beyond the body, is there any meaning to life? And these were existential questions that I would think about, not really talk about. But in the back of my mind, no matter what happened in my life, no matter what kinds of accomplishments I achieved that I really wanted to achieve, or disappointments, in the back of my mind, I would always think, wait, Mark, why do you really care so much? Because in the end, there's no meaning to life. We're in a random universe and we just happen to emerge through this random evolutionary process. And here I was learning about information that was challenging that. So it was a very disorienting period for me roughly 4 years ago, and I'm still adjusting to it. And so I've had to think hard about, well, how do we recontextualize consciousness if consciousness isn't coming from the brain? And the framework that I like to use is the one you see here, adapted from Dr. Dean Radin from the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He says, basically, we don't have to change this idea that we have physics, we have chemistry, we have biology and neuroscience. We simply recontextualize those disciplines, and all of them occur within consciousness. So this apparently physical world is actually just a manifestation of consciousness itself. It's a reversal of the conventional thinking. And there's some quantum physics that supports this idea. I would say that it proves it, but it is supportive of this general idea. And it led many of the early quantum physicists like Max Planck to say exactly this: I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. This was back in 1931. And to quote Erwin Schrödinger, another Nobel Prize winning physicist, he said, "In truth, there is only one mind." And that's exactly what I'm proposing, and many other people are proposing as well, that we live in this one universal consciousness where we are fundamentally interconnected. And this notion of interconnectedness comes up in quantum physics as well, something that Albert Einstein called spooky action at a distance, known as entanglement, where you have two particles that are physically separate from each other, but when you affect one, the one that's far away from it is impacted in a correlated manner at the exact same instant. So the basic idea here is that there is an invisible connection that we can't see with our eyes. That really blows away common sense, but it is supportive of this idea that there is one consciousness that we are all a part of. So to go back to Dr. Bernardo Castro, who also supports this general idea, he says we can analogize this by saying there is one infinite stream of consciousness, like a stream of water, and each of us is a whirlpool within that stream. So we have a sense of being an individual, a localization of consciousness. That's what each of us is in this big stream, but we're fundamentally interconnected. Now, if that were to be true, there would be some predictions or things that wouldn't be anomalies. They wouldn't be paranormal under this model. One is, let's say some of the water from my whirlpool gets into your whirlpool. That's like my consciousness getting into your consciousness. That's a psychic or telepathic effect. So this model of consciousness would predict that psychic phenomena are real. They wouldn't be paranormal. Another phenomenon is if we imagine the whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, the water flows back into the stream. It doesn't leave the stream, it simply transitions into a new state. And the analogy there is that when our physical body stops functioning, when we die, our consciousness doesn't die, it simply transitions into a new form. And this is the principal outline for my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, where I look at these phenomena, the scientific evidence for psychic abilities and survival of bodily death. And the argument I make is, if any one of these things is real, any one, not even all of them, just one, materialism is going to have a very hard time explaining it, whereas we can explain it much more easily with this consciousness-centric view, this one-mind view. And that's not to mention the fact that when people achieve what some would call transcendental states of consciousness, like a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience, or a meditative experience that many people have described in the awakening process, they talk about feeling like they are literally everything. They are at one with everything beyond space and time. It's something we've seen throughout the ages, and it comes up when the brain is in some capacity out of the way, where this one mind is experienced, which is another, I think, very compelling piece of evidence. So what we'll do now is quickly go through each of the various categories within psychic phenomena and survival of bodily death. And in my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, each of these is its own chapter. So I'll give one or two examples of each, but in the book, there are many others. We can start with remote viewing. So this is the ability to perceive something that's far away with the mind alone. So when I learned about this, it sounded so insane to me, and I'm kind of numb to it now because I've seen so much evidence for it, but it's this idea that we can psychically perceive something no matter where it is in terms of space and time with the mind. Now, is there any actual evidence for that? What I didn't realize until I started my research was that the US government ran a psychic spying program for roughly 2 decades and spent roughly $25 million on it. And the CIA, fortunately, has declassified some of these documents, and now people can talk a bit more openly. So in my book, I include some of these documents, which you can see here. Very clearly, they talk about psychoenergetics. Remote viewing is something they were looking at very clearly there. And remote action is the ability to influence something from far away, also known as psychokinesis, which we'll talk about in a bit. The US government was clearly looking at this. And here they say on another page, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. So remember what I said earlier, that if any one of these phenomena is real, the conventional paradigm that's underlying our education and much of society would have to be rethought. And here is some very compelling evidence from the US government that was using this for psychic spying. And they even show in the documents that a scientific panel was looking at this. You can see some of the names here. And the scientific panel says that the implications are revolutionary and the evidence is too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence. That's a little bit of the remote viewing evidence. I found that to be compelling. Telepathy. Telepathy is mind-to-mind communication. And one of the classic studies on this is known as the Ganzfeld experiment. And this is where you have two people. We'll call one person Bob and another person Jane. Bob is sitting in a room, usually in a relaxed state, and Jane is far away where she's shown an image of something. And the experimenters say to Jane, I want you to try to send what you're looking at to Bob in the other room using your mind. And these are not people that claim to have psychic abilities necessarily. Usually they're just everyday people and they participate in the experiment. Bob is just sitting in the room. Jane is trying to mentally send this image to Bob in the other room. And at the end of the experiment, Bob is shown 4 images, one of which Jane was looking at. And the experimenters say to Bob, which of the 4 was Jane trying to send to you? Now, if there were no effect at all, if it were just chance, which is what the mainstream materialist view would say, is the numbers should approach 25%. 1 out of 4 is what we would expect. But it actually, when we look at decades of research, it's closer to 32% of the time that Bob guesses correctly, which might not seem like a very big deal, 32 versus 25%. But when we look at the statistics, this is well beyond what chance would predict. And all of these phenomena, remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, and psychokinesis, are what Dr. Dean Radin calls 6 sigma statistical effects, where the odds that these things are occurring due to chance alone is more than 1 billion to 1 against chance. Meaning that in other areas of science, we would have accepted these phenomena as real. And I'll give a quote from Dr. Jessica Utz, who looked at these phenomena. She gave a report to US Congress and the CIA in 1995 at the conclusion of the psychic spying program. And she said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. The 2016 president of the American Statistical Association said this about psychic phenomena, who's looked at this very closely. So again, that's very compelling to me. And in fact, there was a recent paper, somewhat recent, 2018, by Dr. Edsel Cardenia from Lund University in Sweden, where he looked at the accumulated statistics for all these psychic phenomena, many of which are hotly debated. It's rare that a mainstream journal would pick something like this up. And he showed that there are strong statistical effects, and American Psychologists, the official peer-reviewed journal of the American Psychological Association, published the article. So to me, that was another very significant finding, which accumulated many of these important statistics. Precognition. So precognition is the ability to know or sense the future before it happens. If consciousness is beyond space and time and is the basis of all reality, then something like precognition would at least be possible. And some of the most compelling statistical evidence is a study where a person is looking at a computer screen, and the computer screen is randomly presenting images. Some of the images are neutral, and some are purposely arousing. So like a violent image or an erotic image, something that psychologists know will cause a subconscious reaction in the body, whether it's the skin, the eyes, the brain, the heart. And usually in psychology experiments, I actually remember this from my undergrad days, what's measured is the subliminal response after the image is shown. That if an arousing image comes up, the body will react without your brain actually knowing it. What the experimenters have done in precognition studies is reversed in time this experiment. They measure the body before the image is randomly presented by the computer. So no one knows what image is going to come up. And what the researchers find is that there's a very small but highly statistical effect where the body is reacting seconds before the image comes up in a direction that's consistent with the eventual image, whether it's a neutral image or an arousing one. So this is what some would call evidence for precognition or presentiment. Psychokinesis. This is the ability to impact matter with the mind alone. And if all reality is this one mind, this one stream of consciousness, it would seem to logically follow that if we shift the mind, then we shift the physical reality, because physical reality is a product of our collective minds in a sense. So psychokinesis would be predicted for sure. And one of the classic experiments comes from Princeton University. Dr. Robert John, who was the former dean of engineering at Princeton, and also Brenda Dunn, ran studies for almost 30 years at Princeton. I actually overlapped at Princeton with the lab, but because this was so controversial, most people didn't talk about it. I only learned about this Princeton lab years afterwards. And even though they were doing such amazing research. But what they've done, and others have done this as well, is to look at the behavior of random number generators. These are machines that will spit out zeros and ones in a totally random fashion. And what you get over time is roughly 50% ones, 50% zeros. That's no surprise. What the experimenters ask people to do is to try to mentally impact the machine. So they might say, Judy, I want you to try to put your mind to the machine and make it produce more ones than zeros. And what they find, the experimenters find that the machine behaves non-randomly. It's a very tiny but highly statistically significant effect where the machine produces more ones than zeros. So that's the category of psychic phenomena, just a very quick overview. Next, we'll talk about survival of bodily death. I mentioned near-death experiences earlier. These are instances where a person is in some kind of serious trauma and yet they have a clear consciousness. And some people have tried to argue that these are hallucinations caused by a dying brain. Now, if these were actually hallucinations, then we wouldn't expect the memories that people come back with to be accurate. We would expect them to be hallucinatory. So I think the strongest evidence, although there's lots of other evidence as well, is known as the veridical out-of-body experience, where the person hovers over his or her body and perceives things in the room, sometimes outside the room, and then upon being resuscitated, explains what happened. And the most compelling cases of those are ones in which we have a time stamping, where the person comes back with the memory, we know when that memory occurred, and we know what the brain was doing at that time. That's the most, if you wanted to be really scientific about it, the veridical out-of-body experience, where you can timestamp. And there's a really good book on this called The Self Does Not Die, which compiles more than 100 of these case studies, where it's a veridical account. The person is reporting memories and perceptions that occurred at a time when the brain should not have been capable of producing those perceptions, which by definition is not a hallucination. And that tells us that the near-death experience might tell us something very important about the nature of reality when the brain is out of the way. And this is another example, and it suggests that consciousness might continue when the body dies, because this is a case where the body is effectively dead, even though there is a resuscitation. It's about as close as we can get, and consciousness still seems to persist. Communications with the deceased. So this would include things like mediumship, the ability to talk to dead people. Again, something that I never would have looked at in my psychology days in undergrad. Definitely not something that we studied. But if consciousness is beyond the brain, if we're in this one mind, why couldn't you communicate with water that's elsewhere in the stream? It's definitely possible, at least theoretically. And there have been a number of remarkable case studies. A woman named Mrs. Piper from the 1800s and early 1900s was apparently an amazing medium, and people followed her around, and she produced results that were compelling. But these days, scientists like controlled double-blind studies. And actually, the Windbridge Research Center has run studies with 5 levels of blinding, where the medium who's trying to communicate with the deceased person is speaking over the phone to the researcher, and many aspects of the study are controlled. And what has been found in preliminary peer-reviewed journal papers is that the medium is able to bring back information about the deceased person beyond what chance would predict, just from hearing the first name alone. So we'll want to see more research in that area, but the initial findings are very interesting and compelling. Finally, we'll talk about children who remember previous lives. This was another one I remember when I first learned about it. I was just so blown away by this notion of reincarnation, because it puts life into a new context if reincarnation is real. And the research comes from the University of Virginia, which has been studying this for over 50 years. Their Division of Perceptual Studies, so a mainstream institution, again, has been looking at this. And what they found is they've looked at children who are usually between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. Sometimes they report memories of a life that is not their own. And sometimes the details are so specific that the researchers can find historical records that align with what the child says. And sometimes the details are so specific that the researchers can't reason that the child was just making it up somehow. So I mean, when you see a little kid talking about details of being a World War II pilot, for example, and giving specific details about what happened, and the researchers find that there was a pilot in a plane in the way the child described, that to me is very amazing. But I think some of the even more amazing findings are the ones in which the child has a birthmark or a physical defect that aligns with the death of the alleged previous life. And in some of those cases, the researchers are able to find medical records that actually align with this. So in my book, I include one example that's particularly striking, although there's many others that the researchers have shown. A little girl who has a leg with a very non-traditional shape. This is not what you'd expect from a normal leg, of course. And it looks like it was tied up in a rope. That's the way the leg looks. And in fact, the girl claims that she came from a past life where she was tortured and tied up in ropes when she died. And she even said, "Grandpa, look at what they did to me, how cruel they were." This is a little girl talking about her leg, referring to a past life, and her physical manifestation is somehow reflecting what appears to have happened in a past life. And there indeed was a person that died in the manner she described. So cases like this are very difficult to describe with conventional explanations. The question I've asked myself, many people have asked themselves, and many people when they read my books and look at my work is, Mark, if there's so much evidence for this, there are a lot of smart people out there. How could it be that no one's talking about this and that we're still in the materialist paradigm? And psychic phenomena, survival of bodily death, mystical experiences, they're not really taught much. And what Dr. Jessica Utz, again, she's the 2016 president of the American Statistical Association, she's been asking the same question. And many of the debunkers basically say that even no matter how much evidence there is, it's not going to sway them. And many of them have not actually read the original research themselves. So this is similar to what Galileo faced when he had all his evidence in the telescope suggesting that Earth is not at the center of the solar system. And there were clergymen that didn't want to look in his telescope. So this is, I think, a similar dynamic to what we're experiencing right now. And it goes on really in any area where you see a paradigm shift, because when a paradigm becomes entrenched, it's a belief system. And it's hard to shift a belief system to recognize that one was wrong and that one needs to reconsider. And here we're talking about a very big deal. It's actually one that Dr. Eben Alexander, a former Harvard neurosurgeon, has said that this notion that consciousness is fundamental rather than a product of the brain will make the Copernican Revolution seem relatively minor. And that was the Copernican Revolution was a big deal. The idea that, wait, Earth isn't at the center of everything. We revolve around the sun. We have to recontextualize our own place in the universe. Now, why I and also Dr. Alexander and many others think that this is a bigger deal is that many other of the past revolutions in science have dealt with the way in which we perceive the world around us, which is a very big deal. But here, with this one mind view of reality, we are recontextualizing our own identity. Under the materialist view, our identity is a body that has a consciousness. Under the one mind view, we are a consciousness that's experiencing an apparently physical world through a body. And under this idea, we are infinite beings who are forever interconnected. And that just puts a completely different spin on life. And one of the reasons I've been so passionate about this and decided to write books, even though I had a business, very stable, really ideal business career, is that this is a world-changing idea. And I wanted to put a new lens on it because many people have talked about this, and I'm hoping to appeal to new audiences. Because just having the thought that this is a possibility is enough to shift one's own trajectory individually, but also on a societal level. This is massive. So we'll talk a bit about implications, and this gets more into my new book, An End to Upside Down Living. What does all this really mean beyond just being a scientific shift? And that's a very important one too. For example, most of our equations in science do not account for consciousness. But if consciousness is the basis of all reality, consciousness should be incorporated in our scientific equations. So whereas right now, it's like C equals 0, maybe C doesn't equal 0. So how do we have to change all of science? Arguably, science will have to shift in many ways, but also medicine. The conventional view in medicine is that the body is impacted by our genetics and our environment. Those are the two general factors that impact the physical form. What we see in the research done at the University of Virginia on children with past life memories and associated physical defects and deformities, and sometimes birthmarks, is that there is something else going on that's not genetic and it's not environmental. The researchers at UVA call it a potential third factor. So there might be an entire factor that we're missing in medicine. And we know there are many illnesses, including the current pandemic, that there are mysteries. So one has to wonder how consciousness could play into health. But on a more existential level, thinking about meaning in life, and this is where I've spent a lot of my time, like reprioritizing life and just thinking about what really matters. If we are infinite beings and if we are interconnected and it's not all just a random universe, then how do we live life? What do we prioritize? And one of my favorite examples to at least start to answer this question comes back to the near-death experience. There's a phenomenon known as the life review, where during the state when the person's brain should not be capable of producing a very intense memory or a clear memory, many people report reliving their whole lives in a flash. It's sort of like this Einstein idea that time can change, time dilation. People re-experience their whole lives, and it's not only through their own eyes, but it's through the eyes of the people that they impacted. One of my favorite examples of that comes from my podcast, Where is My Mind, where I interviewed Dannion Brinkley. This is episode 6 of the podcast. he talks about his own life reviews, and he had 4 of them, and because he had 4 near-death experiences. Not everyone who has a near-death experience comes back with a memory of a life review, and not everyone has 4 near-death experiences to begin with. So this is a very remarkable case. And his stands out to me because there was such a drastic shift in his life. He was a very materialistic person before he had his first near-death experience. He fought in Vietnam. He told me that he was vicious in combat. And when he went into his life review, he relived the deaths of the people that he killed through their eyes and felt that pain. And he also felt the pain of the child that would no longer have a father because he had killed the father. So he felt the indirect impact of his actions. And that just shows, again, the interconnectedness of everything. So when he came back, just like many other near-death experiencers, he changed his life dramatically. He became a hospice volunteer. And in his subsequent near-death experiences and life reviews, what he told me is that he started each one at the beginning. He didn't just pick up where it left off. He had to relive the bad stuff every time, but he also got to relive the ways in which he had changed. So he saw himself through the eyes of the dying person when he was a hospice volunteer. And he got to see the ways in which he comforted the dying person, which I think is just an amazing image and has really stuck with me. So if we think about the possibility that a life review is part of some of our lives in the dying process, or maybe even all of our dying processes, how would that shift our priorities and the things that we care about in the world? And imagine how business leaders, political leaders, people in very influential positions might shift their decision-making and their priorities if they thought the life review was actually just built in to the fabric of reality. So that's something that I think about very often. And it changes everything because every interaction has a different meaning. And what the researchers often say, and also the near-death experiencers say, is that the little things are the big things in the life review. What people come back remembering is not how big their house was or what kind of car they drive, but rather how they treated the cashier in line. And if they treated the cashier poorly, they see the way in which that interaction negatively impacted every other person in line afterwards. And people usually come back saying, wow, I knew better and I could have done better. So if the little things are the big things, that also is a very empowering idea. And that's one of the big messages I would love to get across today, but with my work in general, is that if we are all infinite beings interconnected, it doesn't matter who each of us is on the surface in this world in terms of positions of quote unquote status or wealth. That's not what seems to matter in the context of at least the life review. And if we're interconnected, it makes sense that we're all contributing in some way. So you can imagine a hypothetical instance where a person who, let's say, is very financially challenged, thinks that he can't have a big impact on the world, but learns about the life review and says, okay, I'm going to go to the store and be really nice to the cashier today and ask the cashier how she's doing, for example. And he does that and it makes her day. And then she's much nicer to someone later in the day who comes in line to pay for his food. And she doesn't know that that man is the head of a major biotech company who's going to cure cancer. And because of that interaction, he's in a much better mood and he's more motivated with his colleagues and his scientists, and it nudges his company to get closer to a cure for cancer. That's just one theoretical example that's actually very plausible. And there's something in chaos theory, it's known as the butterfly effect, where a very small change in an initial condition can have a massive or disproportionately large impact somewhere else. So the butterfly effect is a butterfly flapping its wings in China can cause a hurricane in New York, mathematically speaking. So that's something I always like to think about. I like my readers and listeners, I encourage them to think about that, because if we are part of this one mind, if we are infinite beings, and there does seem to be some kind of imperative to try to treat each other as well as possible, then all of us can have a big impact on the world and be more altruistic, or as altruistic as we can be. Because in this context, altruism is actually a form of selfishness, because when you're helping other people, you're helping yourself, because at the level of the one mind, we're all the one mind. It puts a different spin on everything. And just imagine for a second what that would do to the world if more and more people just started to at least think about the possibility of that. And it also aligns, I think, with our own internal feelings. It usually feels good to help other people, and there's lots of neuroscience that there is happiness that is corresponding with giving. So it's very different than the materialistic worldview, which says we're all just biological machines. We're going to live, we're going to die, there's no meaning to life. And I might as well just accumulate as much stuff as possible, and it doesn't really matter because I'm going to die anyway. If that's not true and there is more meaning to life, it could shift society in a very big way. And so to me, this is the core idea, this rethinking of reality. It's like it's the disease that's underlying all of the symptoms in the world. Like the problems that we see, quote unquote, they are symptoms to me of a deeper issue. And that deeper issue is the misunderstanding of reality. The belief that we are finite and separate beings rather than infinite and interconnected beings. That's the disease, I think, that if we could understand on a more holistic collective level, we could see positive changes in society. So I will pause there. Judy, I know there might be some listeners and viewers who want to ask questions, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, there's one thing that I just wanted to kind of say that I love that your background is in business, because you know, those of us who are in the science community, a lot of, even here at FMBR, we have a lot of scientists come and speak, and healers and stuff for whom this worldview is very familiar, right? And what I love that you're doing is moving in, you know, bringing it out of our bubble, you know, to people like in education and politics and business, where you know, because I think on your on the blurb on your book, it says, you know, this change in mindset is really the antidote to what our civilization needs at this time. And I love that it's that it's through the vernacular of science, right? It's data. It's data driven. But I think you would find the same data if I mean, not about you would find solutions emerging if people had this worldview, right? How can I be of service? How can I be of assistance? How can I make someone's life better? And I just love what you're saying and how you're bringing it out from your point of view.
Well, Judy, thank you for saying that. I mean, this was one of the reasons I decided to write the book. At first, I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I learned all this information. I'd spent a year researching, didn't even know why I was researching, never planned on doing this stuff. But I realized the implications of all this. And I knew that no matter what it was going to do to my business career, that it didn't matter because I had a different worldview. And ultimately, within the last few months, I transitioned out of my firm because I want to focus full time on all this. I mean, once this becomes an internalized reality, it shifts everything. And in my new book, I started the book by asking the question to the reader and also to myself: what is the overall intention of your life? In other words, what is the orientation that drives all of your values, behaviors, and decisions? It's like, where do we align our compass? And to me, the world is collectively aligning our compass in a certain direction, and it's based on a faulty view of reality. Exactly. And if we shift the view of reality, it's like two boats that are taking off on different degrees. You know, if you shift just a tiny bit, the boat will end up in a very different place.
Right, right. And Barbara Marx Hubbard talked about sectors of society, you know, in any society, that she talked about 12 sectors, you know, education and politics and food production and medicine and things like that. And she kind of puts it on a circle. And at the center of the circle is worldview, right? And I think when that worldview, I kind of visualize it as sort of going up a turn on the spiral, or just kind of raising in vibration, that the assumptions that we make that are, you know, that cause us to compete and to want to conquer and to want to, you know, just kind of kick the little guy or say, I got mine and you're on your own. Those, I think, would just fall away if we have, you know, what you're saying as a mindset.
Yeah. Yes, the priorities and the overall approach and attitude would shift. And I think it's also important to recognize that the individual self also becomes more important, because each of us individually is part of the one mind. So while we want to service others, the term I use in my new book is compassion with discernment.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be as compassionate as we can be, but that is not at the exclusion of protecting ourselves and setting boundaries and saying no as appropriate. Because if we can't be the best version of ourselves, if we're allowing in darker energies or doing things that are not right for us, then we can't be of service in the same way. So it's also very important. Anita Morjani, who survived a near-death experience, her story is remarkable. She had terminal cancer. She was going to be dead. And when she came back to her body, because in her near-death experience, she had this realization that she was saying yes too often. And she was just being too compliant, and realized that her worldview needed to shift in other ways too. She came back, her cancer disappeared miraculously. The doctors don't understand what happened. And she says that now she is much more focused on what her needs are. And she, at the same time, she is giving. So I think it's both, and that's an important distinction. I give an example in my new book, An End to Upside Down Living, of a woman who reached very high states of consciousness. She was feeling infinitely loving towards everyone, and it actually led to a very bad situation because she was not discerning. She allowed a man into her life, into her home, who ended up basically taking over her life for several months because she wasn't able to discern. Oh, wow. So it's a very important nuance to this, is that the overall attitude is one of helping the world as much as we can while protecting ourselves.
So I have a question here from Paul, who says, what do you say about the skeptics who debunk all the studies you mentioned? And I mean, anyone who looks at the studies, they're voluminous, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say they just debunk them all. But more importantly, the role of Wikipedia, which consistently downplays or outright excuses these well-established phenomena.
That's a great question. Wikipedia is something I mentioned in both my books, and it's something I've looked at, because if you Google Dean Radin or Rupert Sheldrake, usually the word pseudoscientist comes up, whether it's Wikipedia or other sources. And if someone doesn't have time to research this and they just Google the person's name and they see pseudoscience and they see disproven, not everyone has the time to look into that. So it's a very unfortunate situation. And I don't know the dynamics of how Wikipedia works. There's something going on where people who are challenging the paradigm, not just in consciousness, but in other areas too, I see that there is a more negative slant to it. I don't know what the solution is to that. It's definitely a troubling issue. And it's one that is holding back, I think, this overall movement of consciousness. But even beyond Wikipedia, I think there has been unfair media attention and also not enough media attention to these ideas. I mean, this stuff should be front page of every paper. This is the biggest topic in the world. I'm one voice, there are many voices, but this is shifting everything and we're not talking about it. So I think there's something deeper going on as well.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think? It's besides I'm just thinking, you know, it's such a positive worldview. It allows for so much you know, positivity and kind of the possibility for a better way of living. And it's a little surprising that people are resistant. What do you think is behind that? Is it fear? I mean, if you know, for the psychic studies or the near-death studies, or what's your take?
Well, I'm going to go from my personal experience here. I remember when I was first sharing this with various friends, many of them work in business, finance, very traditional thinkers. And some were receptive, of course, and that gave me good feedback. But there were a few that were automatically skeptical, even when they saw the statistics. And I'm thinking of one friend in particular who said the statistics are too good. They must be fabricated. And the scientists, of course, would want to make this is a revolution. And of course, they're going to want to show finding of psychic phenomena, because that's like that's the Einstein of today level. So there must be something wrong with the studies because the statistics are too good. And if this were real, people would know about it already. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of smart people, and a lot of smart people disagree with you, Mark. So you're not a scientist, and that you have some fringe scientists looking at this. Not many universities are. Princeton had a lab, but that shut down. UVA has a small division of perceptual studies. No one's looking at this. Come on.
Yeah. Brenda Dunn was our speaker last month, or a couple of weeks ago, actually. She was great.
Yeah.
Mary wants to know if you've had any anomalous experiences of your own.
Many. When I first started on this path, it began with synchronicities. they were events that were so, I couldn't reason that they were random, where words would be appearing over and over again, or very random themes would be appearing where I think of something, then it would happen. I also started to work with lots of psychics and energy workers because I wanted to explore, and that the science said that this is real, so people should be able to do this. And there were some people that were able to know things about me that they could not have known through any other means. And that was crazy. Or they predicted things that they could not have known. That's been anomalous. And I would say even more recently, I've had anomalous experiences in meditation. It's only in the last few months since I decided to transition out of my job where I wanted to make all of this my full-time focus. Even though at the time when I left my job, I didn't even know what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan of writing a second book at the time. But when I made the decision, this was in December of 2019, it's almost like releasing that which was not aligned with me anymore, allowed new ideas to come in and new passions where I said, wait, I could write a second book. And so what I did, because I had a few months earlier this year to transition out of the firm, I worked part-time because I didn't just want to leave immediately after spending 10 years and being a partner. I wanted to do it very smoothly, as smoothly as possible. But I was able to do things that I couldn't have done previously, like retreats, because my job was so client heavy that I had to be on call all the time. And I couldn't just turn my phone off for a week before, but I was transitioning out. So I was able to do that. And I went on 2 silent meditation retreats, one in February, one in early March. One was with Adyashanti, a well-known spiritual teacher. And another was with Mukti, his wife, who's also a spiritual teacher. And they were both in the Bay Area. One was 6 days and one was 5 days, both no talking, no gesturing at people. The only thing you could read was a 1-page meditation sheet, and there was a satsang question and answer every day where you could ask a question, and that was it. And the rest was meditation. I had a hard time meditating for 15 minutes before that. And things started to happen to me a few days in and have continued since then, where the energy became physical. I had read about energy and prana, chi, universal life force energy. All of a sudden it was real, and it wasn't something I was trying to do. It was happening to me. I'm sitting in a retreat center, and all of a sudden I'm feeling pounding on my forehead in between my eyebrows. That's the position of the third eye. So chakras became very real. And I've had some rather, I would say, extraordinary, meaning literally they're not ordinary experiences in meditation, where I was overtaken by a feeling that I can only describe as love, but it was beyond like a personal love. It's very difficult to put into words, but it was extremely blissful. And it was so intense both times it happened at that level that my body actually had to shut it down because I thought I was going to die. My heart was beating out of my chest, and my body stopped the energy because it was too much. And now I've been meditating hours a day for months, and this same energy comes in. I feel it right now, actually, but especially in meditation, and it's kind of in smaller doses. And I even feel it moving downward, like it's coming in through the crown, and there's a third eye, then it's into the throat, and it's descending. In this, it's not something I have control over. It's almost like a lava lamp. And I feel in the limbs sometimes that I would say that is extremely anomalous, because when those things happen to you personally, I know what I've experienced and felt, and that is not explainable unless we shift our worldview.
Right. And I saw that on your podcast, you interviewed Paul Selig, the channel, and he talks about energy, love as a frequency, right? Now we tend, I think in our old worldview, in the established worldview, we want to keep it at sort of a level of emotion. And it's like so much more than that. It's a frequency that he talks about, and that, you know, that you can actually feel.
That's how I think about it as well. I like to say that love is not an emotion, rather it is a quality of the one mind. Mm-hmm. It is what the one mind, the one consciousness is. So when we experience a feeling of love, really all that's happening is that the barriers that are obstructing that pre-existing love have gotten out of the way somehow. Right. So it's not something that we get. And this is also when people talk about the process of enlightenment. You don't get enlightenment. It's more a process of subtraction. Mm-hmm. To become a pure vessel of this love frequency, of this, whatever you want to call it, intelligence that we are the vessel of.
Right. Okay, let me ask, do you have any views on the UFO phenomenon?
I've never directly experienced a UFO. It inevitably comes up in my research. What people report, there's a book by Kenneth Ring who studies near-death experiences also. He has a remarkable book looking at people who have been blind since birth who during a near-death experience can see and then come back into their body and they can't see anymore. So this gets to the idea of the brain actually restricting consciousness in some way. He compared the UFO abduction phenomenon to near-death experiences because apparently people report a similar shift in consciousness. There are similarities in some UFO reports where the person's consciousness changes. Sometimes it's a very pleasant event, just like a near-death experience. Although both near-death experiences and UFO events can be negative too. There are reports of that. So also just on a more general note, I mean, if we live within this massive universe, within an infinite consciousness, and I like to think of that consciousness as being infinitely intelligent, because if we are whirlpools within the stream and the individual whirlpool has some degree of intelligence, it follows that the entire stream has some degree of intelligence. And if we look at the entire physical reality, both at the micro quantum level and also at the macro universal level, there is immense infinite complexity. And that is all occurring within consciousness. So that suggests to me that consciousness itself has this incredible intelligence. So if we are in this big universe, I think it's egocentric to think that we would be the only forms of intelligence, that Earth is it. Just looking at the probabilities of how big the universe is and how many stars are out there and planets at a certain distance that could house human life or just intelligent life in some way. I would say I'm very open to it. I have not written about it extensively. I have seen accounts of people that have past life memories from other planets. There's a book by Dr. Linda Bachman who does past life regression hypnotherapy, and she has found her patients spontaneously talking about a past life that's not on Earth. She calls them interplanetary souls. So this is occurring in many independent areas. Also on the psychedelic DMT, some people report other intelligences that they'll call alien intelligences. So in these independent areas, it's coming up, and it just seems to make sense. If you look at how big the universe is, I would say I'm open to it.
Right. Have you ever encountered the idea that the speed of light is actually the speed of consciousness, which is why our perception of time changes when we change our velocity through the universe or our gravitational frame of reference? So consciousness may also be the link between relativistic physics and quantum physics.
It's a great point. And that's one of the biggest questions in all of physics, is how do we reconcile what we know to be true at the quantum level, the micro level, and the relativistic level, which is at a larger scale. There is no unifying theory that can reconcile those two. The equations blow up, apparently, when you try to put quantum theory and relativity theory together. And I think what the question is getting at is, could consciousness help us reconcile that? I think that's what the question is asking. And that's completely my belief, is that science is missing the key variable, that all the physical is occurring within consciousness. And if we somehow put that into the equation, we'd be able to understand these things that work independently.
Absolutely. Mary says she loves that you shared your personal experience. Let's see. Yeah, I was going to ask about this too. There are spiritual paths which teach what you've talked about. So for thousands of years, this has been true in a lot of mystical spiritual traditions, and I think physics is just catching up. Change the name of consciousness to soul, universal consciousness, or God. That it's the same thing. Eckanar teaches how to realize yourself as soul or consciousness. Meditation or contemplation, which you mentioned, can teach you these experiences. Yeah.
Okay, a few things. Is there more?
Well, it just says using mantra who seems to help many people. It's available to everyone, but not everybody is ready. I think this is a good point, right? Not everybody is ready for this awareness.
Yeah. If more people were ready, I think the world would be very different. And that's been something that I've had to think about hard when I put out books and a podcast, is I'm trying to present the material in the most compelling way possible, because I know what an impact it had on me. So I want to streamline that process for other people without even my being there. They can hopefully pick up the book or listen to the podcast and on their own, if they want, take it in, for those who are ready. So that is an important point. You can't force this on anyone. People have to realize it on their own somehow. And the best I think all of us can do is be the best versions of ourselves, be compassionate with discernment. And if people are ready, then we can share what we're ready to share with them. And I want to also address what you mentioned about spiritual traditions and kind of how to name consciousness. In my new book, An End to Upside Down Living, I talk a bit more about this. The one mind itself could easily be likened to what many cultures call God, but not in the personal sense. There is this cultural perspective sometimes that God is a separate being, whereas this idea says that God is both, and consciousness, one mind, is immanent within and transcendent beyond. It's both. That's more of a mystical perspective. And I think to me, that's a more comprehensive truth. So the issue with the word God, and it's one that I struggled with for a long time. Growing up, I rejected all this, like anything religious or spiritual. I thought it was all superstition. And the word God was very much like a separate, almost a human being, not a human being, but a superhuman, a third party. But this idea is suggesting that it's within us, which is extremely empowering. And that's an important concept to keep in mind. The notion of the soul, I think about the soul as still a form of ego, meaning there is a localization of being separate within the soul. So it's almost as if the whirlpools are multidimensional. And so there's being in the body in a whirlpool, but then there's a type of a whirlpool that's on another dimension, that's our soul level, and probably other manifestations of that. So I would say, in short, yes, there is a tie to all the spiritual traditions. This is nothing new. This is just putting Mark's lens on it, just because I felt very strongly about putting it out there and hopefully reaching new people. I also wanted to address the different paths. It's something I also talk about in Into Upside Down Living, because I've had to think about this too, as well. Once you accept this, what do you do? How do you actually live, practically speaking? What are the best ways to advance ourselves so that we can be the purest vessel? And I like the way the yogic tradition divides the categories, even though this can be applied to any tradition. And I've simplified these four categories. And these are what some would call the path to enlightenment, or the path to the full realization of ourselves so that we can be the best vessel. One is known as jnana yoga, which is knowledge or wisdom. And for me on my path, that was huge. When I started, it was reading, learning, and I still do that. Another one is karma yoga, which is selfless service. And I'm applying this to my life because it's an exercise I do all the time. What am I doing to be of service? And for me, books, doing lectures, being interviewed, doing my podcast, those are initially how I'm being of service, and I don't know how it's going to manifest in other ways. But it can also manifest on an interpersonal level, on the way that I treated someone today, for example. But it's this idea of selfless service. Third is known as bhakti yoga, which is a more devotional aspect. So that could be prayer, chanting, but this idea of love for the divine, love for the one mind, because that is us to some degree. At the highest level, everything is us. So having that loving sense for it, that's one of the paths. And the last one, broadly speaking, is known as Raja Yoga, which is energy, I'll call it, even though there are probably sub-segments of this. So this could be meditation, breathing exercises, qigong, many things would fall into this category. So when I'm living every day, I constantly think about what I'm doing in each of these four paths. What am I doing with knowledge, wisdom? What am I doing with service? What am I doing with devotion? What am I doing with energy practices in some capacity? And in the yoga tradition, I think the belief is that usually a person starts with one, and then as they elevate in that one path, the others naturally come into play because they're all interrelated. They're sort of aspects of the same thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Suzanne wants to know, I assume this is something you know. She says, please tell the story about the person being killed who loved her killer and created a different outcome. Is this a story you've told?
Yeah, this in my new book, there's a section on forgiveness. I assume that's who she's talking about. The woman's name is Isira, and she did a great interview on one of my favorite podcasts called Buddha at the Gas Pump, which I listened to hundreds of hours of that before writing my second book, not knowing that it was going to influence my second book. But that's an important show because it shows people that have gone through the awakening path from completely different backgrounds, different cultures, different spiritual traditions, and there are many parallels. This woman named Isira, she went through a very brutal event where she was being murdered. And during that period, she had almost like a near-death experience state, but she became everything in the room, including the person that was killing her. And at that moment, she felt the pain of this person. So that's why I put this under the forgiveness category. She forgave him for what he was doing because she felt his pain and that he was taking out his pain on her. And what she claims happened is that some kind of, I don't know, dimension opened up and he realized what he was doing. He realized that he was making a horrible mistake and he said something like, oh my goodness, I'm killing an angel. So he ended up taking this woman to the hospital and ended up saving her life.
Isn't that amazing? Byron Katie tells us a similar story about just, I think I probably won't get it right. I think she was being mugged. She was, someone was taking her pocketbook or something and had a knife, and she just had that presence to say, she said to him, thank you. I know you're doing the best you can do. I know you're doing the best that you can. And he sort of stopped and dropped everything and ran away. It was just, that kind of loving and forgiving presence really is very powerful.
There's an energetic resonance that gives off, I think. That's what I found personally and just with other people around me, of having that attitude, even though it's natural to have emotions like anger or what would we call negative emotions. One of the topics I talk about in An End to Upside Down Living is this concept of non-resistance. If emotions come up, we should let them be, but we shouldn't act irresponsibly on them. It's when we suppress the anger that we actually end up probably spiraling it and it can cause more problems down the road. So if there is anger, maybe the way to get it out is on our own to yell and scream and do whatever you have to do and get it out of your system. But when we're interacting with another person, to let that be and to act in accordance with this one mind perspective. Yeah,
exactly. So are you getting any pushback from the business community that you were a part of, or even, from Princeton or the communities that you've been a part of?
Most of the feedback has been very positive. I haven't gotten much negative feedback. It's also possible that the negative feedback just doesn't get to me, right? Or the people that are not drawn to this would put the book down after a few pages, or wouldn't even buy the book, or listen to episode 1 of the podcast and say, I'm done with this.
Right.
So it's probably self-selecting. I will say that in the last few months in particular, I've heard from people that I don't know who are very successful in the business, financial worlds, who told me that they read my book or listened to my podcast and they've had a major shift as a result. Mm-hmm. And so they just wanted to, many of them thanked me, which I really appreciate because I don't hear from everyone that reads my book or listens to the podcast. But it's really nice to hear that that's happening because they say that it's impacting their own sphere as well. It's this rippling effect. It's the butterfly effect where everyone around them is being impacted because they're elevating themselves. They're asking questions. They might be conducting business differently or looking to be more philanthropic. Or if they have a for-profit enterprise, where are they investing? And what are the products actually doing? Are they going to think about the downsides of their products even more? Because if you think about the life review, do you want to put a product out that could be harmful to people? All of a sudden that becomes, the money that you would get from it doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't counterbalance the negativity of it. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping it has a positive impact.
Yeah, I can't imagine that it won't. I mean, it's the ripple, right? And I think just talking about these things puts that energy out, and someone hears it and someone else, it's just going to go out and go out and go out. And that's what we're all about. I think that's what you and IONS and us and so many other groups and individuals are really kind of coming to this awareness that we want to be in service to the frequency of love on this planet.
One of the topics I talk about in my new book is the concept of stewardship, mm-hmm. that each of us has something that we can contribute. It could be a skill, it could be financial resources. There's something that we're uniquely good at, and it could seem small, it could seem really big, but it is our duty to be stewards of those traits or those resources and use them in the optimal way possible. So it becomes a personal exercise of really evaluating what are the things that I'm good at? What do I do well in the world? What are the things that I don't do as well? And being very honest about that. And then looking at the things that we do well and figure out how we can contribute using them. So for me, in my own personal journey, I like to share it because it makes us more concrete. When I look back at my life, in many ways, I was trained to be able to do what I'm now doing without realizing it. Like, I mean, my undergraduate, I had to do a senior thesis, where most undergraduates, you don't institutions, you don't have to do that, but I had to do it at Princeton. In my professional life, I had to learn a lot about complex technologies and intellectual property, complex ideas that I had to learn to synthesize and make simple for a board of directors who might know nothing about technology.
Right.
So now when I look at the skills that I have accumulated over time, my question to myself is, what am I doing to contribute using those skills?
Mm-hmm.
And it's an exercise we can all do.
Exactly. And I think, you know, I was reading Charles Eisenstein's book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And he talks about that too, you know, just like the effect on the world of taking care of an elderly relative, or just being kind in the moment to, you know, a crying child or something. It doesn't have to be, you know, some giant enterprise that changes the world, because the vibration of that, just the small acts of kindness contribute, you know.
It's so important to keep in mind, because I do hear people sometimes think, well, what can I really do? And we have to remember that reality works beyond what our eyes can see, the way in which things work. So an impact on the field of consciousness for one kind act that no one sees with their eyes, we don't know the ripple effect that's having on the overall field. So
Exactly.
I hope that empowers everyone listening, because you can all do it. It doesn't matter if you're writing books or not writing books, or speaking publicly or not. I just happen to be doing this. This is for me, this is my path right now. But it doesn't have to be that way for everyone. I think we each have our own unique role to play. It's almost like we're puzzle pieces, and we have a different role, and our job is to be the most authentic version of ourselves,
Exactly.
be a vessel of this consciousness, and be stewards of our skills to be compassionate.
Right. Right. And if we're, you know, that puzzle piece, to not see yourself as integral to what's happening on the planet, to the, you know, to the life and growth and nurturance of, you know, positivity on this planet, because you're not doing something, you know, that you're maybe working in small ways, is it's just not true, right? Yeah. It's just not true that people are, that there's anyone who is not integral to what's happening on this planet right now.
Well, an analogy I use in my new book is that the human mind is incapable of understanding this intelligence. It's sort of like we can't understand infinity. And an analogy I also use is from the story Flatland, where imagine people living on a flat piece of paper in two-dimensional land. You imagine that a sphere, a three-dimensional sphere, intersects with it. That intersects as a circle for the people in 2D land. They can't perceive the sphere. All they see is the circle. So they're analyzing the circle. They understand everything about the circle, but they miss the sphere. And that's sort of like us trying to judge anything, to say, oh, well, that's a small act. That's not going to do anything. That's like saying we understand the sphere. You don't know what it's going to do for the whole circle.
Right, exactly.
Excuse me. That's like saying, yeah, we don't know what it's going to do for the whole sphere. I misspoke.
Whole sphere. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I think, do you have a preferred method of meditation?
I've looked at many different types. The one that I have adopted is in line with Adyashanti's, which is sort of a non-method. It's sitting and being in a state of surrender. And sometimes I'm thinking a lot, and maybe I need to be thinking, and I'm processing. But this idea of the intention of surrender, that I am a vessel. As a human being, Mark Gober, I really don't understand anything. Knowledge doesn't come from me, but rather knowledge comes to me from the stream of consciousness. So I'm going to sit in that. And I also like to follow the advice of the author, Reverend Bill McDonald. He says that for any practice, whether it's meditation or otherwise, if you add love to it, the feeling of giving and receiving, it automatically makes any practice better.
Absolutely. Okay, we have two more questions. Have you investigated the source of free will?
Talk about this in my new book. Very complicated issue.
Absolutely.
And I think it's one that the human mind cannot comprehend ultimately. And even the question might not be relevant. We think it makes sense, but it's almost like asking, what color is a circle? The question doesn't make sense. So we have to accept that maybe the question itself doesn't make sense. But if we say that it does make sense, and we're trying to understand part of the sphere, just the circle part of it, there is a one mind, this infinitely intelligent one mind that can do whatever it wants in theory, because it's everything. So in theory, at the level of the one mind, it doesn't seem like a big logical leap to assume that it has infinite free will, because it is everything. The question then becomes, how does the will of the one mind relate to the will of the whirlpool? At some level, there is no whirlpool, there's no individual, but that's of course not what we perceive on a daily basis. This is the paradox, that we perceive separation and duality, but at some level, there's no separation, non-duality. The way I try to think about it, because at some level, there is no free will of the individual, because the individual does not exist. So there couldn't be free will for that individual. But it's almost like the best that we can do is try to channel the will of the one mind. And that's an overall intention of saying, whatever will I think I have, because I'm so smart and I know what outcomes are best, I surrender that to what some would call the divine will, or the will of the one mind.
Right. I was thinking again about your practice of surrender in meditation, right? I think that's really key.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. Do you think that AI or machine learning could help us in any way recognize the one mind or speed up our understanding of it? I mean, that's really big here, right, in the Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's another question that's related that I'll get to first on AI, because some people think that we will create conscious machines. Once we learn how the brain works and we can basically reverse engineer it and then just create it in a machine. It's like the show Westworld, where the machines took over at a certain point. They reached a level of complexity and they became resentful of the humans and they took over. This idea that consciousness magically pops out. And of course, that goes against everything that I'm saying. Federico Faggin, who is one of the inventors of the microprocessor, has come out with a similar argument that we're never going to make AI conscious. What matters is the consciousness of the programmer, because the machine can still act like a computer and do things, but it's never going to have emotions and feelings in the way that we do. That subjective experience of being alive. So the consciousness of the programmer is where the danger is, because you could make an AI machine that's very dangerous and harmful to the world. But at the same time, I think there are benefits to AI and technology in general. There are things that we can do to enhance our lives and make things easier and take away just some of the hardships. So it's a double-edged sword, because there are definite dangers of AI, but I think we can use it in a positive way too.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this. And good luck. Oh, yes. So tell us about your website and your podcast.
Well, Judy, thank you for having me. And I mentioned my new book, Into Upside Down Living, which I feel very passionately about. It's I hope that it helps people and helps us as a society. That's why I'm doing it. And also my podcast, Where Is My Mind, which I've mentioned. It's an interesting story how that came about, because when I was first when I first wrote the book, my publisher said, look, it doesn't matter how good your book is, you need to have a presence so that people know who you are and you can actually get the book to more people that way. So I said, well, I've learned a lot through podcasts. I should do a podcast on my own. And I texted one friend who works in media, the only friend I know in media, was doing TV sports shows in New York. I said, do you know anything about podcasts? And he goes, I'm about to leave my TV show to work at the biggest podcast producer. And he said, Mark, don't do a traditional podcast. Don't just do interviews and put it out there. We need to make this into an engaging, like just very short form version that people can digest when they're on the subway. So I listened to him, even though I was resistant to it. I wanted to just get it out there. We worked with top tier producers on this, where the episodes include clips from the dozens of scientists that I interviewed. So in the near-death experience episode, you'll hear from Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia and a bunch of other scientists, Raymond Moody, but then you'll hear from also people that had the life review, the actual people that had the near-death experiences. So those are available on all the major podcast players for free. They're 8 episodes, 30 to 40 minutes each. And I'm hoping that appeals to a different audience, because some people don't like to read books.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.